right now, we're going to have a great session from Ferraz, who's the CEO and co-founder at Incognia, on some of the stuff that they're looking at and research that they're doing into mobile app authentication friction and UX for finance-based apps. So please help me to welcome Andre to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Hi there, can you hear me? Is the mic working? Okay. Cool. So the purpose of this presentation is just to shed some light on how the US-based financial services apps are doing in terms of authentication, especially looking from a UX standpoint, right? So the idea is to show you some data on research we did recently, in which basically we downloaded like pretty much the top 50 apps in the US to understand which type of MFA methods they were using to give some more clarity about where we are really in this space. So let's see if this works. Next slide, please. Okay. Nah, not working. So on the next slide, actually. So just quick thing here on the agenda. So I'm going to provide some market background here, explain briefly the methodology we use for this research, and then bring some of the highlights here, so the stats around login activity. And we have divided this in two different types of login activity. The first one for known devices, so devices that are already authorized to access that account. And then the second part here for unauthorized devices, right? So when you're setting up a new device, let's say you just bought a new iPhone, for example, you want to log into your account. There's usually a little bit more friction, so that's why we decided to split the results in these two buckets. The other thing is that we are also going to discuss here very briefly the use of other techniques to reduce friction on the authentication process that usually work behind the scenes. So this type of research is not able to capture that. That includes things like behavioral biometrics, device IDs, and things like that. And finally, share some of our takeaways from this research. So quick background here. As you know, account takeover is a big problem in the financial services industry. In 2020 alone, about $56 billion were lost due to account takeover fraud. Big part of that is originating from social engineering scams, phishing, et cetera. And this is one of the main problems that usually trigger financial services companies to add more layers, more friction to the authentication process. The second, which is quite obvious for everybody here, users hate friction, right? The end user typically would choose convenience over security, even if they are aware about the risk they're taking. And as an example, when the use of MFA is not mandatory, right? It's optional for users. They tend not to adopt it, right? So we see the challenges that the industry is facing as a whole on convincing users to adopt that. So it's quite obvious that users don't like friction overall. A few more data points here. When it comes to device change or device authorization, there's this statistic here that about 96% of the smartphones sold in the United States are sold to existing smartphone users, which means that they're switching devices, right? They're going from one iPhone to the next iPhone, not really a truly new mobile user, right? So there's about 136 million mobile devices that are being activated by these users, which means that the device change process or device authorization process is really critical, because if you think about an individual user, they would do this like once every 2 years, for example. But when you see that scale, you see that optimizing for also enabling users to switch devices more easily is also quite important, right? Second thing is that the average user has about 40 apps on their mobile device, which means that every time they buy a new phone, they have to set up their accounts on these usually 40 different applications. So one more reason to think about the device authorization experience. Then finally, on the other hand, right, when we see that type of behavior when users are switching devices, when users are setting up a new device, only 0.5% of these are fraud attempts, right? So only 0.5% of the login attempts coming from new devices to an existing account are really a fraudster trying to take over an account, right? So if you put a lot of friction on that part of the process, that could basically prevent good users from setting up their accounts on these new devices. So there is a lot of unnecessary friction, especially in that part of the user journey, which is when they're switching phones, right? So the research we did was basically around downloading the top 50 US-based financial services apps. That includes also crypto apps as well. And all of the tests were made by the same person on the same Wi-Fi connection. And basically that was necessary to eliminate variability on this process, right? And as I said earlier, what we did here was basically to analyze the behavior on authorized devices, so devices that had already access to that account, and for unauthorized devices, so basically devices that never had authenticated to that account, right? So, few more data points before we get into the actual data. The test for known devices, we basically recorded two things. The first one was the number and the types of authentication methods that were offered. So in many cases, we saw a combination of password plus something else. And also the persistence of the login. You have some financial services apps that once you log into that device on your account, you are able to access it, and the app won't ask you for a password again because they trust that device. There are others that are time-based, for example. So like in 15 minutes, you need to type your password again if you close the app, if you don't leave the session open. There are some apps that have some specific event-based situations in which they would log you out and ask for a password again. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then on the other side here, for unauthorized devices, the data was pretty much the same, but the main difference here is that some of these apps would also do some sort of partial KYC process when you were setting up your account on a new device, right? So because of this, we decided also to measure the time it takes to set up an account on a new device. So a few highlights here. Pretty much every app in the financial services space here in the US still relies on the password as the primary factor. About 75 to 80% of the apps also leverage biometrics. So the sum here is obviously more than 100%. So the main point is that many of the apps that are offering passwords as the primary factor also give the option for users to replace that by using on-device biometrics like Face ID and others, right? And then the minority here are reliant on PIN numbers, which are basically simpler versions of a password. In terms of login persistence, the vast majority are non-persistent, which means that once you log into your account on that device, something will log you out, and it really depends on the application. In some cases, if you simply close the app, next time you open it, they're going to ask you for a password again. Others are time-based, so even if you close the app but you reopen it very quickly, you won't be asked for a password again. But clearly, the vast majority don't let you logged in on that device all the time, right? So you have to log in again at some point. Another data point here, and for me that's actually the the most relevant part of this is the secondary factor, right? So once you type the password or once you enter with your biometric information, the next part here is the secondary factor, right? Vast majority still doing OTP over SMS, 62%, which for me is quite scary because I don't trust this method at all. So OTP over SMS, we know that it's highly vulnerable to phishing, large-scale interceptions, and other things. So it's a highly vulnerable form of MFA. But still, the vast majority of the US financial institutions rely on SMS as their secondary factor, right? Second most used are, actually we have a tie here between authenticator apps and magic links. There is a higher concentration for authenticator apps on the crypto space. So most of the crypto wallets, crypto exchanges, they would ask you to use an authenticator app like Google Authenticator, for example. And when we are talking about more traditional financial services companies, they rely a little bit more on magic links that are sent usually over email. And then finally, push notifications, OTP over email, and some companies are not relying on a secondary factor for authentication on known devices, right? So these are devices that have had access to your account in the past, right? So you already logged into this account on this device. The next part here is around the unknown devices. So when you're authorizing a new device, primary factor here in this case is 100% passwords. They're not reliant on biometrics. In this case, it's quite obvious because there is no link between that account and that device yet. So the way you establish that link is by using a password. So in this case, 100% of the apps are reliant on passwords. The average time to log in from a new device was 53 seconds, which for me is quite a lot, spending almost a minute to log in to an account, right? And 25% of the apps took over 1 minute, right? You usually have to go through about 6 screens and to fill about 4 fields of information. So as I said in the beginning, there's kind of a partial KYC process that goes on with most of these financial services apps when you're trying to set up your account on a new device, right? When it comes to the secondary factor, SMS is by far the big winner here, 75%. Again, not very secure, very vulnerable to phishing and social engineering in general. But the vast majority, 3/4 of the top 50 US financial institutions are still relying on this secondary factor for users that want to set up a new account. For me, honestly, this is the basic answer for why we're seeing such a rapid increase in account takeover fraud these days. Basically because this type of secondary factor is very, very easy to social engineer, to convince the end user to share that information with you. Once that information is shared, the fraudster can take over your account very, very quickly, very easily. So this is what we saw for device authorization. Obviously, this type of research cannot detect other techniques for authentication. So things that go behind the scenes like device IDs, right? With this type of research, we're not able to see if this mobile application is doing anything to uniquely identify that device. But we estimate that the vast majority of them do a good job in regards to this, basically because all the time we tried to log in from a new device, the process was different, right? So that indicates that these applications have an ability to detect the device and identify them uniquely. But we were not able to gather this data because for the end user, that's invisible. And the research was done as if we were an end user. The second is behavioral biometrics. We know that many financial institutions are leveraging these type of techniques to mitigate things like bot attacks, for example, and also to identify fraud. So this is also something that the end user cannot perceive. So we were not able to detect which financial institutions were leveraging these techniques. Third, location behavior. Even though in this case, the application has to ask for permission, right, to collect the location data, it was also difficult to understand if this type of data was being leveraged for authentication purposes or not. Many financial institutions, for example, would leverage location data to do things like help users find ATMs, for example. But they may not be using this data for authentication purposes, even though it's a way to increase security quite significantly. And then finally, zero-factor authentication, which is basically the combination of the use of device ID and location behavior. Same thing, we were not able to see which apps were leveraging this technique. But my guess is that probably the ones that were not using SMS-based OTP were basically using something like one of these four here to trust that device more quickly without having to add friction to the user experience. So key takeaways here. First one is that passwords are still far from dead. And we know multiple ways to replace this. This conference is all about this, but we have to take a look at what's going on right now in the market and understand the challenges. But certainly there is a great opportunity here to help the financial services space to take the next step and replace passwords, which I think all of us here agree that it's not the most secure and not the most user-friendly way of authenticating people. Second is that OTPs over SMS are by far the #1 secondary factor, which is not good at all. Very easy to social engineer. And then finally, we were unfortunately not able to understand exactly which type of signal-based recognition were being leveraged by the financial institutions, but that's certainly a way to reduce friction. So that's all I had for today. Happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Andre. Do we have any questions in the room?
There's
Great.
one over
I'll
there.
come over to you.
Hiya.
Hi.
You mentioned that there was an average of 6 screens to log
Yes.
in for 4 fields.
Mhm.
I'm guessing that was sort of extrapolated across all of them, but were there any kind of screens that didn't include fields that just had information, and was that accounted in the average time to log in? Like, did you take time to read through those screens?
Yeah, well, given we experimented 50 different apps, it's hard to answer your question in a precise way. But basically, the rationale here was, okay, once I try to log in to my existing account on a new device, how many screens will I'll go through until I get to the logged in session, right? In this case, basically, that's the number we've got to. In terms of fields, it's basically additional information that the financial institution are asking you. So that is usually KBA, right? So they're asking for your date of birth, mother's maiden name, things like that. But it's hard to answer your question because we analyze a pretty large number of apps. So I can't give you a specific example here.
Thank you.
Sure. Any additional questions?
So with regard to the prevalence of SMS OTP, particularly in financial services, this is less of a data question and more just a general question or your opinion on what is it going to take to get the financial institutions to understand that they need to be moving away from phishable authentication, and And from your perspective, is it a knowledge, education, cost issue? What do you think about that?
I'd say that it's mostly knowledge and education. So I can speak to about some of our customers. Most of them were relying on SMS as their secondary factor, and their biggest problem was around account takeover fraud, right? We saw with some of these customers that there was a trend of the social engineering activities becoming more and more sophisticated when it comes to automation. So a lot of things like bots on social media, for example. So let's say you followed the social media page of a bank, right? Another page would follow you back with a very similar name and would ask you for feedback. So initially it doesn't look like anything suspicious. You start talking to that bot. At some point, that bot is going to send you information about a transaction that never occurred, but they would ask you, like, do you recognize this? And then the person would say, no, I don't. Well, we need to help you, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to send you a code to your phone, right? Please share this code with me so I can help you with that. Boom, account takeover, right? So that was happening at scale using bots on social media. Pretty smart type of process that was being implemented. When they tested our data, they were able to see, okay, everything looks good. The password is correct. The second factor here is also good, but this user is logging in from a completely different location that we've never seen this user before, and this fraudster is spoofing GPS information to show that they are at the user's home address, but they're not. They're even in a different country or a different state. When we caught this, we said, okay, this is clearly an account takeover, right? And with these customers, on average, they were able to bring it down by usually 90 to 95% after adding an extra layer of protection. But this extra layer, what was good was that they were also able to remove the friction completely, right? Because by using a data point like this, which is more of a behavioral analysis, they didn't ask the user to do anything, right? They were analyzing data they already had. So by doing that, they were able to, one, eliminate SMS, so eliminate friction, but also bring account takeover fraud down by like 95%. So yeah, I think we need to go through this process with more and more customers so they can see that you can improve security, reduce friction at the same time. And once this becomes more and more normal, I'm sure that we're going to see a very different graph in 3 years from now.
That would be great. Did we have any other questions in the room? Okay. Thanks so much, Andre.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah.